Zdraske Trevana. If this is your first time with us, thank you for checking us out. We're excited you're here. If you are a returning visitor, thank you also. We're thrilled that you've decided to keep learning with us. In our previous lesson, we introduced the letters of the Abuka and went over how to pronounce them. In this episode, we'll be covering how we, here at Learn to Agra, recommend one should go about writing each letter. So very briefly, some acknowledgements before we begin. The Ta Agra project website provides minimal guidelines when it comes to advising how Ta Agra should be written. In fact, all they say is that it is written left to right, top to bottom, and in a cursive style. So for the sake of consistency, and in an effort to remain true to their intentions, we have tried to keep our instructions regarding how to write each letter to as close to those guidelines as possible, breaking or bending them only when we think it is acceptable to do so. In practice, we have found that it is difficult to adhere strictly to these guidelines for the forms of every letter. It seems counterintuitive, for example, to begin the initial form of ge at its peak. Do, bo, sahi, shadi, def, thato, the initial forms of Ooho and Boji, and Sakai are also letters which we believe are most efficiently written when begun at their bases rather than their tops. Our point here is that we interpret the Ta Agra project's instructions regarding how to write each character to be open-ended. We also understand that everyone's handwriting styles and abilities will be different, so when practicing, we advise that you go with whatever feels natural and easiest for you. With that being said, however, we will be presenting what we believe to be the simplest and most efficient methods of writing each character. When determining how to write each character, we noticed what seemed to be discrepancies between how some letters appear on the Ta Agra project website and how they appear when they're typed with their calligraphy font, which if you haven't downloaded their calligraphy font yet, you definitely should. It's super cool. We'll go over which letters we think have discrepancies later in the video, but for now we'll tell you that for all of them, we defer to how it appears in the font. So without further ado, let's begin. Okay, so just a few more things we'll need to know before we start writing. In case you don't know this already, every character in the Abuka, with the exception of Sakai, has three distinct forms: initial, medial, and terminal. The form that a letter takes in a word is determined by its placement. If a letter is first in a word, its initial form should be used. If it's the last letter of a word, its terminal form should be used. And by default, the medial form is used in all other cases. Almost all of the forms are pretty much identical. Almost. There are some slight differences in a couple of them, so be watching for those once we start writing. Also, as a reminder, a diacritic refers to a glyph added to an existing character that alters its sound. The vowels ehi, iho, ohi, and ooho, so pretty much every vowel except the three A's, are diacritics, and we will demonstrate how to write them once we get to them. Ooho we think is a little funny because we see no reason why its initial and terminal forms can't be considered their own character. However, we can see how its medial form might be considered a diacritic. So without getting too far ahead of ourselves, for the most part, we'll say yes, Ooho is a diacritic, and if you're confused already, we promise this will make more sense once we start writing. So let's get into it. Okay, so the software that we're going to be using to demonstrate how to write each character is called Sketchpad. If you'd like to check them out, we'll include the link in the description. Essentially what you see before you right now is called a guideline grid. And a guideline grid is just a handwriting and penmanship tool that is made up of these three lines here, a top, middle, and bottom line. And it's a tool that's used to show where a character should be written and how to write characters. You've probably seen something sort of like this maybe from elementary school or kindergarten or whenever you were taught how to write letters of the alphabet. These are the tools that we're going to be using to demonstrate how to write our characters. There's a plethora of other handwriting and penmanship terms that we don't really go over here. I found a sheet of terms on the internet if you would like to check them out. I'll also include that link in the description. But for now, the only term that we're going to be needing is guideline grid. Last thing before we get started, just as a general rule of thumb, our letters will pretty much take up the entire guideline grid for the most part. We're going to be spanning the upper half and the bottom half, top line to bottom line for the most part. So that's just a general rule of thumb. Okay, so without further ado, this is Ooho. We'll start with its initial form, which begins at the close to the top and then ends in the middle. Its medial form picks it back up in the middle, goes down to the bottom line, and its terminal form loops all the way back up to the top, just like that. Next is Aito, which is shaped essentially the same as Ooho, with the exception of this cute little line that we add in the middle, and that is Aito. Next is Eito, our third and final A vowel, and it is also shaped pretty much the exact same way, except its cute little line we add to its bottom, just like that. Eito. Next we have Be, and Be was a tricky one. We experimented with several different ways to write it. However, what we're about to show you is what we think is the most efficient way to write all three forms. Like we said earlier, if you feel that something else is easier, go with that 100%. But this is what we feel and have found is to be most efficient. It begins with an initial stroke from left to right and a second stroke. Its medial form, essentially similar, and its terminal form, we do that. That's how we do it. Next we have Cho, which is essentially an elongated backwards S, at least its initial form is. We'll begin up here, just like that, and put a dot in there. Now that line right there that I've just drawn is essentially a courtesy mark that indicates the beginning of the next letter, since this form of writing is in a cursive style. But all that mark does is indicate that you are to go on to the next letter in the word, and several characters will do that. They're not actually part of the character themselves. Its medial form and terminal form. Voila. Next we have Do, which I think is pretty fun to write. The important thing to remember here is that only its initial form dips below the middle line, and we'll demonstrate that now. And its medial form and its terminal form, which is just a lovely swoop. Do. Next we have Eho. Eho is our first diacritic character. Eho is essentially just a dot that we add above characters. Eho in its initial form is a dot that is written above the middle line and to the left of the second character. In its medial form, Eho is written directly above the middle line and in between two characters. And in its terminal form, our dot is written to the right of the next to last character, again above the middle line. Eho. Next is Fi. Fi frustrates me a little bit sometimes just because it's so similar to just a cursive F in English. But its initial form looks like this, beginning above the middle line, medial form, and its terminal form. Yeah, very similar to just a cursive F, so Fi. Next we have Ge, which is personally one of my favorite letters to write. It's so swoopy, right? So swoopy. Ge can be done in essentially 2 strokes. The second stroke being that line that crosses it down the middle. And that's Gehi. Next we have Hi, which is very simple to write. It's essentially just 2 lines in all of its forms. They cross. They straddle. No, not straddle, that's not the right word. They cover the middle line. That is Hi. Next we have Iho, which is another diacritic. This diacritic follows the exact same rules as Eho, except rather than a dot, Iho is a cute little U. And it looks just like that. Iho. Next we have Joja, which is another one of my personal favorites. Joja is essentially just Cho without the dot, and it looks exactly the same. It's Cho without the dot. Joja. Next is Ket. All 3 forms of Ket can be accomplished in essentially 2 fundamental strokes, and they are as follows. Boom, boom. Its terminal form has that cute little swirl on the end, but essentially, that's get right there, yeah. Next we have Lee, and Lee, in my opinion, is perhaps one of the prettiest letters in the alphabet. Let me show you what I mean. Its initial form is this beautiful curvy shape there, and its medial form is essentially the same, just not as big. And for the terminal form, we get to round it off there underneath the middle line. It's important here to add that little curve inward when you're falling back on your line that you've drawn. Otherwise, it might be confused with Ooho, right? Maybe we can see how its medial form looks very similar to Ooho if we weren't careful and added that little curve inward like that. Lee. Next is Mo, which we begin from the top and go down. But again, if you find that it's easier for you to start from the bottom and go back up, you do you, but we're going to begin at the top. And it's essentially these two strokes here, and medial form and terminal form. And that is Mo. Next we have Neen, and Neen is essentially Mo without the line, right? We don't have that little line in between. And yeah, so Ni and Mo are very similar. Neen is just Mo without the line. Neen. Next we have Ohi, which is another diacritic, and this diacritic is actually written below the middle line this time, and it follows the exact same rules as all the other diacritics. However, this time it is a dot that is written below the middle line. Some scripts, sometimes, you'll see it in the font as a curve or as a little tail like that. Either will do. It's just as long as it's something, a little line or a dot that's below the middle line, I'm sure it'll come across, that this is Ohi. Ohi. Next we have Po, and Po's initial form looks like this. Its medial form and its terminal form, which we can accomplish in one line. That is Po. Next is Gehi. The medial and terminal forms of Gehi are essentially the same. Its initial form differs only in that its initial form has a loop that dips above the middle line, and we'll show you what we mean here. So that's its initial form, and its medial form remains below that middle line there, and its terminal form ends us out just like that. Gehi. Next we have Ro, and all three forms of Ro are shaped essentially the exact same as Ooho. However, they differ in that Ro has a cute little dot below it. Sit right underneath it. That's the three forms of Ro. Next is Arro, which is essentially the same as Ro, except instead of only one cute little dot, we get to draw two. And that is Arro. Next we have Sahi, which is essentially just a mirrored version of Jojo, right? And so that is what Sahi looks like. Essentially just a mirror of Jojo. So next we have Asi, which is one of those letters that we believe we found a discrepancy in between the way that the character looks on the calligraphy font and the way it's presented in the Ta'agra project website. We go with the font character and the font style of writing. We're going to present both just so that you can see the difference. However, we prefer the font style. So this is the font style of Asi, and Asi remains above the middle line. It never goes below. And looks like that. Now the only difference between the font and the website was in the initial form. And the initial form, it did have it going below. Let me do something else. It did have it going below the middle line there, like that. So again, we opt for the font style, and that is Asi. All right, next is Shadi, and we can think of it as either a mirrored Cho or just as a Sahi with a dot in its rightmost curve, and it looks like this. Dot, dot, terminal form, dot, and that right there is Shadi. Our next two characters are Tef and Thato, and they are two more of those characters that we believe we found discrepancies between the font and the way it's presented on the website. Again, we go with the font, and the only difference is this, right? So Tef sort of does that. However, we believe the font does this, and it's, again, you know, obviously it's such a minor difference. It almost doesn't even matter. However, we think that when writing, the font way of writing is actually will be faster. And so that's Tef. And Thato is essentially the same. Thato is essentially written the same, however, it has a dot in it. And again, we go with the font style for this one, right? So the website has it sort of looking like this. However, we believe that it's easier to do that. So, you know, such a small difference there. We think it does carry some weight, though, in terms of saving time when you write. So Tef and Thato. Next is Ooho, and Ooho is a funny character that we sort of talked about earlier in the video. Ooho, we sort of debated with ourselves as to whether or not to call this one a diacritic, and the consensus we finally decided on was that we will refer to its medial form as a diacritic. However, we see no reason why its initial and terminal forms cannot be considered their own characters. So is Ooho a diacritic? Kinda, sorta. Its medial form we think can be considered a diacritic, and we'll show you what we mean when we write it. So its initial form goes all the way down, its initial form begins at the bottom of the character, and then its medial form is just a line and another line added to it. So we don't see why that can't be considered a diacritic. However, its terminal form, just like its initial form, can all be completed in one stroke. So there's no need to add another stroke. Which we think is a sort of defining characteristic of a diacritic. So because we add the stroke in the medial form, we think we can consider that form as a diacritic. However, the other two, we see no reason to. So basically, is Ooho a diacritic? Kinda, sorta, but that's Ooho. Next is Boji, and the forms of Boji are very similar to Ooho. They look like that. And it ends like that. Boji. So very briefly about Wehi here, our next character. Its initial form of Wehi we really think can be written as really just sort of an M. We see no reason why, you know, we can't do that. However, for its medial form, we really do think it's necessary to be deliberate and make our two backwards C shapes there. Otherwise, it could, you know, sort of start to look very similar to Yohi, right? So if we're lazy with the way we do our signs or our curves on the medial form of Wehi, it might look very similar to the medial form of Yo, and that's what I've just drawn above. But the terminal form of Wehi, we do like that. So next is Yo, and here it is in its initial form, and here it is in its medial form, which, as you can see, looks like it could be mistaken for the medial form of Wei if you're not careful, and that is Yo in its terminal form. So if you're not deliberate with your curves for the medial form of Wehi, it could perhaps be mistaken for the medial form of Yo. So next we have Sakai, which essentially takes on the form of Sahi. However, it adds, you know, a cute little thing below it there. So here it is in its medial form with its cute little thing added, and its terminal form with the cute little thing added again, and that is the forms of Sakai. And last but not least, we have the Tokai, which, thank God, actually only has one form, right? Only exists in the medial form. You're never going to see a Tokai as the first character of a word or as the last character of a word. So that is how you write a Tokai. It is written above the middle line, in between characters. Tokai. Alright, that concludes our lesson for today. Thank you so much for learning with us. If you'd like us to clarify something we covered, or if you just have a question in general, please don't hesitate to drop it in the comments section or reach out to us at our email, which we'll include in the description. If you liked what you saw today, please consider subscribing or recommending us to a friend. In our next lesson, we'll be covering common letter combinations and punctuation. Sugar and Saiyans, Trevana, and see you next time.